The gunshot echoed across the valley as Jessamine Reeves spurred her mare harder, the darkness of the Colorado night swallowing them both as they raced away from the lights of town. Blood trickled from the graze on her arm, but there was no time to tend it, not with Harlan's men still hunting her. Rain had begun to fall, turning the mountain trail treacherous, but she pressed on, knowing she had only one chance at survival. Stories of the reclusive rancher who lived in these hills had reached even Gunnison's saloon girls, and Jessamine prayed they were true, that Colton McAllister was as honorable as they said. As a lightning bolt split the sky, illuminating a rustic cabin nestled among pines, Jess finally saw salvation. With trembling legs, she dismounted, stumbled to the door, and pounded with what little strength remained in her body. The door swung open to reveal a tall man with weather-worn features, a Colt revolver held loosely at his side. His eyes, sharp as flint, took in her bedraggled appearance, the torn dress, the mud-spattered boots, and the fresh blood staining her sleeve. Without a word, he stepped aside, but not before his deep voice cut through the storm's fury. "Who's after you?" Jessamine swallowed hard, pushing back damp curls from her face. "Harlan Price and his gang. They think I witnessed something I shouldn't have." Colton McAllister nodded once, his jaw tightening as he glanced past her into the darkness. "Get inside," he said, his tone brooking no argument. "And bring your horse round back." It was 1878, and Gunnison was still finding its footing in the rugged Colorado territory. Law was something men like Colton made for themselves out here, far from town and the newly established silver mines that had brought both prosperity and trouble to the region. Jessamine led her exhausted mare to the small stable behind the cabin while Colton kept watch, rifle now in hand. Once inside, he barred the door and moved to the window, scanning the ridgeline with practiced eyes. The cabin was simple but orderly, a far cry from the chaotic saloon, where Jessamine had spent the last 3 years serving drinks and enduring wandering hands. "They won't track you in this rain, at least not tonight," Colton said, finally turning to face her. "But come morning, that's a different story." "I'm sorry," Jessamine whispered, suddenly aware of how she must look and what her presence might mean for this stranger. "I didn't know where else to go." Colton moved to the fireplace, stoking the dying embers back to life. "You're bleeding." "It's nothing, just a graze." "Sit," he commanded, pointing to a wooden chair. He retrieved a worn leather satchel from a trunk, pulling out bandages and a bottle of whiskey. "This'll sting." As he cleaned her wound with gentle but efficient movements, Jessamine studied him properly for the first time. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 30, with sun-streaked brown hair and a beard that couldn't hide the scar running along his jawline. His hands, calloused from ranch work, moved with surprising delicacy as he wrapped her arm. "Thank you," she said when he finished. "Most men wouldn't help a woman like me." Colton's eyes met hers, something unreadable passing through them. "And what kind of woman might that be?" Jessamine looked away. "A saloon girl. I worked at the Silver Dollar in town." "I didn't ask for your occupation," he replied evenly. "I asked who was after you." The straightforwardness of his response startled her. "Harlan Price owns the Silver Dollar. He uses it to gather information, make deals with the mining companies." She paused, gathering her courage. 3 days ago, I overheard him arranging the murder of a man named Joseph Bennett, a claim jumper," they said. "Tonight they killed him in the alley behind the saloon, and I saw everything." Colton cursed under his breath. Bennett wasn't just any prospector. He was working with the territorial marshal to expose corruption in the mining claims. He moved to a cupboard, pulling out a tin of coffee. "Price won't stop until you're silenced, same as Bennett." "I know," Jessamine replied, her voice barely audible over the rain hammering on the roof. That's why I ran. I thought I could make it to Durango, maybe further south, but they were faster than I expected. Colton set a mug of coffee before her, then took a seat across the rough-hewn table. You picked a hell of a storm to flee in, and a hell of a mountain to seek refuge on. Despite everything, Jessamine felt a smile tug at her lips. I heard stories about the rancher up here. They say you don't tolerate trouble and that you're a fair man. People talk too much, Colton muttered, but there was no real annoyance in his tone. You need sleep. Take the bed, I'll keep watch. Jessamine shook her head. I can't take your bed. You can and you will, he countered, rising from the table. Dawn comes early, and we'll need to decide what to do with you then. Exhaustion suddenly overtook Jessamine, making her sway slightly as she stood. The adrenaline that had carried her through the night was fading, leaving only bone-deep weariness in its wake. The small bed looked impossibly inviting, despite its simple frame and plain quilt. Thank you, she said again. The words inadequate for what he'd offered safety, if only for a night. Colton nodded, his attention already returned to the window and the darkness beyond. Get some rest, Miss Reeves. Jessamine awoke to the smell of bacon and the soft sounds of movement. For a disorienting moment, she forgot where she was, then the events of the previous night came rushing back. She sat up quickly, wincing as pain shot through her injured arm. Sunlight streamed through the cabin windows, revealing details she'd missed in the dim lamplight. Hand-carved furniture, bookshelves filled with volumes she wouldn't have expected in a rancher's home, and a faded photograph of a woman holding a child. Colton stood at the iron stove, his back to her as he tended to breakfast. Good morning, she said, voice still rough from sleep. He turned, nodding briefly. Thought you might sleep till noon, coffee's hot and food's nearly ready. Jessamine slipped from the bed, suddenly conscious of her disheveled appearance. She smoothed her torn dress as best she could and ran fingers through her tangled auburn hair. I checked your horse at first light, Colton said, setting plates on the table. She's rested enough, though she could use a proper day or two of recovery. The implication was clear. He expected her to leave. Disappointment settled in Jessamine's chest, though she couldn't blame him. Her presence endangered him as much as herself. I'll be on my way after breakfast, she said, taking a seat at the table. I've caused you enough trouble. Colton placed a plate before her, eggs, bacon, and biscuits still steaming from the oven. Eat first, then we'll talk. The food was simple but perfectly cooked, and Jessamine realized she hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. She ate with unexpected appetite while Colton watched the trail leading to the cabin, rifle propped against the wall within easy reach. Harlan Price isn't just some saloon owner, Colton said finally, returning to the table. He runs half the criminal enterprises in 3 counties, and he's got deputies and judges in his pocket. If he wants you dead, distance alone won't save you. Jessamine set down her fork, appetite suddenly gone. What would you suggest, then? I can't stay here. No, Colton agreed, you can't, but running without a plan will get you killed. He paused, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. There's a federal marshal in Denver who'd be mighty interested in what you witnessed. Name's Hollister. He's been building a case against Price and his backers for months. Hope flickered within Jessamine. You think he'd help me, if your testimony can bring down Price? He'd probably put you up in the finest hotel Denver has to offer. Colton's mouth quirked in a half-smile, the first she'd seen from him. The problem is getting you there alive. Price's men will be watching all the trails and passes, Jessamine said, thinking aloud. And the stagecoach would be too obvious. Colton rose, retrieving a map from a drawer and spreading it across the table. There's an old mining trail that cuts through here, he pointed to a winding line through the mountains. It's treacherous, but Price's men won't expect it. 2 days' hard ride would get us to the railroad at Montrose. Us, Jessamine echoed, meeting his gaze. You think I'd send a wounded woman alone through those mountains? Colton asked, raising an eyebrow. Besides, I've been looking for a reason to have a word with Marshal Hollister myself. Why would you risk this for me? You don't even know me. Colton's expression hardened. Price and his kind have been squeezing honest ranchers and miners out of this territory for too long. If your testimony can help end that, it's worth the risk. Jessamine studied him, wondering what personal grudge might lie beneath his words. There's more to it than that, isn't there? Before Colton could answer, a sound from outside caught his attention. In one fluid motion, he grabbed his rifle and moved to the window. Riders, he said quietly. 3 of them coming up the main trail. Fear clutched at Jessamine's heart. How did they find me so quickly? Someone must have seen you heading this way. Colton's mind was already working, calculating odds and options. Quick, there's a root cellar behind that trapdoor. Get in, and don't make a sound no matter what you hear. Jessamine hesitated only briefly before lifting the trapdoor he'd indicated. The space below was dark and cramped, smelling of earth and stored potatoes. She descended quickly, and Colton closed the door above her, leaving her in near total darkness save for thin slivers of light between the floorboards. Minutes stretched like hours as she crouched in the cellar, straining to hear. First came the sound of horses in the yard, then boots on the porch. Colton's voice, deliberately casual, called out a greeting. "Morning, gentlemen. What brings you up my mountain?" A deeper voice answered, one Jessamine recognized with a chill as belonging to Seth Morgan, Harlan Price's right-hand man. "Just passing through, McAllister. Tracking a thief who stole from Mr. Price last night. A woman, red hair, green eyes. Seen anyone fitting that description?" "Can't say that I have," Colton replied. "Not many folks come this way, especially not women alone. Mind if we look around? She might have passed through without you knowing." There was a pause, and Jessamine held her breath. "My land, my rules," Colton said finally. "You want to look around, you'll need more than suspicion and a badge bought with Price's silver." Tension crackled in the silence that followed. "You're making a mistake, McAllister," Morgan growled. "Price doesn't forget those who cross him." "Noted," Colton replied evenly. "Now, unless you'd like to discuss water rights or cattle prices, I've got work waiting." More silence, then the sound of retreating footsteps. "We'll be watching the trails," Morgan called back. "If you're hiding her, we'll know soon enough." Jessamine remained frozen in place, listening as horses galloped away. Even after the sounds faded, she didn't move, fearing a trap. Finally, the trapdoor lifted, revealing Colton's grim face. "They're gone for now," he said, helping her out of the cellar. "But they'll be back, probably with more men." Jessamine brushed dirt from her skirts, her hands shaking slightly. "Thank you. I know what it cost you to stand against them." Colton moved to the window again, watching the trail. "They already suspected I was no friend to Price. This just confirms it." He turned back to her, decision evident in his stance. "We need to leave now. They'll expect us to wait until nightfall, so we'll use that against them." "What about your ranch?" Jessamine asked, suddenly aware of what he was sacrificing. "Your home." A shadow passed over Colton's features. "Been thinking of a change anyway," he said, the lightness in his tone not quite reaching his eyes. "Pack whatever food you can find in that satchel by the door. I'll ready the horses." Within 20 minutes, they had prepared for departure. Colton had changed into riding clothes and packed efficiently ammunition, supplies, the map, and a small lockbox. Jessamine pretended not to notice. He'd given her a spare shirt and trousers that had belonged to his younger brother, years ago. The clothes were still too large but far more practical for riding than her torn dress. "The path I'm thinking of isn't on any map," Colton explained as they mounted up. He rode a powerful buckskin gelding while Jessamine was back on her mare, now rested and fed. It follows an old game trail for part of the way, then cuts through Sullivan's Pass, narrow going, but impossible to spot from below. "Won't they expect us to head for Denver?" Jessamine asked, adjusting to the unfamiliar sensation of riding astride rather than side saddle. Colton nodded. "Which is why we're heading south first, then doubling back east when they've committed to the wrong direction." They set off at a measured pace, Colton leading them away from the main trail and into dense forest that soon obscured any view of the cabin behind them. The day was clear but cool, typical for early autumn in the mountains. Under different circumstances, Jessamine might have appreciated the spectacular scenery: towering pines, aspen groves shimmering gold in the sunlight, and distant peaks still capped with snow. As they rode, Jessamine found herself studying Colton's back, the way he sat easily in the saddle, moving as one with his horse. There was something compelling about his quiet competence, his unwavering focus. "You never answered my question," she said as they paused at a stream to water the horses. "Why are you really helping me? It can't just be about opposing Price." Colton knelt by the water, filling his canteen before responding. 3 years ago, Price's men burned out a small ranch north of here. The owner had refused to sell, same as me. His voice remained level, but Jessamine could sense the controlled anger beneath. "That ranch belonged to my brother James. He died in that fire along with his wife." Jessamine's heart sank. "I'm so sorry." Price made it look like an accident. "No witnesses, no proof." Colton stood, securing the canteen to his saddle. "I've been gathering evidence since then, but nothing concrete enough for the law to act on. Your testimony could change that." The personal cost of his quest was written in the lines of his face, the watchful caution in his eyes. Jessamine understood now why he had been so quick to help her, a stranger. "We should keep moving," he said, already mounting up. "There's a ridge ahead where we can watch for pursuit." They rode in companionable silence for the next hour, climbing steadily higher into the mountains. The air grew thinner, the trail narrower. Twice, Colton backtracked and took alternative routes, explaining quietly that the main path would be too exposed or too obvious. From the ridge, they could see for miles the sprawling forests, the distant glint of a river, and far below, tiny figures on horseback. Price's men, Colton confirmed, lowering the field glasses he'd been using. 6 of them heading north along the main trail. "They think we're making for Crested Butte." Relief washed over Jessamine. "So we've thrown them off our trail. For now," Colton cautioned. "But never underestimate Seth Morgan. He's a former Army scout, knows these mountains almost as well as I do." They continued their journey, the terrain growing increasingly challenging. By mid-afternoon, Jessamine's muscles ached from the unaccustomed riding position, but she refused to complain. Every mile put distance between them and danger. "There's a hunting cabin about 2 hours ahead," Colton said as the sun began its westward slide. "Belongs to an old trapper who only uses it in winter. We can shelter there tonight." The cabin proved to be little more than a one-room shack, dusty and disused, but it offered walls and a roof. Colton insisted on tending the horses himself, while Jessamine gathered firewood from the nearby pile. Inside, they worked in tandem, Colton building a small, nearly smokeless fire in the stone hearth while Jessamine unpacked provisions for a simple meal. The domesticity of it struck her as strangely comfortable, despite the circumstances. "You're handy around a cabin," Colton observed as she efficiently prepared coffee with limited supplies. "Didn't expect that from a saloon girl." Jessamine smiled slightly, stirring the pot. "I wasn't always at the Silver Dollar. I grew up on a farm in Missouri, knew how to keep house before I knew how to read." "What brought you to Gunnison?" Colton asked, testing the heat of the coffee pot with a cautious finger. Jessamine paused, memories washing over her. "My father died when I was 16. Farm went to creditors and my stepmother made it clear I wasn't welcome anymore." She shrugged, aiming for nonchalance. "I followed my cousin west, worked as a housekeeper in Denver until she fell ill. Medical bills took everything we had. And the silver dollar paid better than scrubbing floors," she said simply. "I never—" She hesitated, suddenly caring what he thought of her. "I served drinks, dealt cards, nothing more." Colton's gaze held no judgment. "Not my place to question how anyone survives out here." They ate a dinner of beans, dried beef, and hardtack, talking little but growing more comfortable in each other's presence. As night settled fully over the mountains, Colton checked their perimeter one last time before barring the cabin door. "I'll take first watch," he said, settling into a chair with a clear view of both the door and the single window. "You should sleep while you can." Jessamine nodded, fatigue catching up with her. The cabin had only one narrow cot pushed against the far wall. She lay down fully clothed, pulling a threadbare blanket over herself. "Colton," she said softly as sleep began to claim her. "Thank you for everything." In the firelight she thought she saw his expression soften. "Get some rest, Jessamine. Long day tomorrow." She fell asleep watching his silhouette against the dying fire, feeling safer than she had in years. The next morning arrived with a thin layer of frost covering the ground. They set out at first light, following game trails so narrow that branches scratched at their clothing. The path climbed steadily upward, switchbacking across steep slopes where a single misstep could send horse and rider tumbling hundreds of feet. "Sullivan's Pass lies just ahead," Colton said, as they paused to rest the horses around midday. "It's the most dangerous part of our journey, a knife-edge ridge with drops on both sides. But once we're across, we'll have a clear shot to Montrose and the railroad." Jessamine nodded, trying not to betray her nervousness. She'd never been good with heights, but there was no alternative route that wouldn't add days to their journey. The pass proved even more terrifying than Colton's description. Barely wide enough for a horse in places, it stretched for nearly a mile along a ridge that seemed to touch the sky. Wind gusted unpredictably, threatening to unbalance them. Colton led the way, his confidence in the path bolstering Jessamine's courage. Halfway across, disaster nearly struck. A loose stone gave way beneath her mare's hoof, causing the horse to stumble and slide toward the edge. Jessamine cried out, clinging desperately to the saddle as the world tilted beneath her. In an instant, Colton was there, having somehow dismounted and secured his own horse in seconds. He grabbed the mare's bridle, steadying the frightened animal while Jessamine fought for balance. "Easy," he murmured, his voice calming both horse and rider. "You're all right. Look at me, Jessamine, not down, just at me." Her panicked gaze found his steady one and she drew a ragged breath. His hand reached for hers, warm and solid. "I've got you," he said simply. Those 3 words, spoken with such certainty, anchored her. Slowly, the mare regained secure footing, backing away from the precipice. Colton didn't release Jessamine's hand immediately, and she found herself reluctant to let go. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded once, finally releasing her hand to check the mare for injury. "She's sound. We can continue, but we'll go slower. Stay right behind me." They completed the crossing without further incident, though Jessamine's heart didn't resume its normal rhythm until they descended into a forested valley on the other side. By late afternoon, the terrain had become more gentle, rolling hills replacing sharp mountain ridges. "We'll make camp by that stream," Colton decided, pointing to a sheltered spot near a brook. We've made good time. Should reach Montrose by tomorrow afternoon if all goes well. They set up camp with practiced efficiency, their movements already synchronized after just a day of traveling together. As darkness fell, they sat beside a small fire, the horses grazing nearby. "What will you do?" Jessamine asked suddenly. "After Denver, I mean." Colton prodded the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling upward. "Hadn't thought that far ahead." "You can't go back to your ranch," she pointed out gently. "Not after defying Price so openly." "No," he agreed, "but Colorado's a big territory, might head further west, start fresh." Jessamine studied his profile in the firelight. "Alone?" The question hung between them, laden with unspoken meaning. Colton turned to meet her gaze, something vulnerable crossing his features before he masked it. "Been alone a long time," he said quietly. "Gets to be a habit." "Not all habits are worth keeping," Jessamine replied, surprising herself with her boldness. A crack of gunfire shattered the moment, the bullet splintering a tree trunk inches from Colton's head. Instantly, he tackled Jessamine to the ground, covering her body with his own as more shots rang out. "Stay down," he ordered, already drawing his pistol. "Crawl to those rocks, I'll cover you." Jessamine scrambled toward the boulder formation he'd indicated, heart pounding as bullets kicked up dirt around her. Colton returned fire, the exchange illuminating the night in brief, terrifying flashes. From her position, Jessamine could make out at least 3 attackers moving through the trees. How they had found them, she couldn't guess, but Price's determination to silence her was terrifyingly clear. Colton reached the rocks seconds after her, blood streaming from a gash on his forearm where a bullet had grazed him. "You're hit," she gasped. "It's nothing," he said grimly, reloading his revolver. "But we're pinned down. The horses have scattered and they're between us and the trail." "What do we do?" Colton peered around the edge of the boulder, ducking back as a bullet ricocheted off stone. "There's a ravine about 50 yards behind us. If we can reach it, we might be able to circle around and lose them in the dark." More gunfire erupted closer now. Their attackers were advancing, using the trees for cover. Jessamine realized with sickening clarity that they were running out of time. "I'll draw their fire," she said suddenly. "You can flank them from the side." "Absolutely not," Colton growled. "I'm not using you as bait." A bullet struck the rock just above their heads, showering them with stone fragments. In the momentary lull that followed, Jessamine could hear men's voices coordinating their approach. "We don't have a choice," she insisted. "I can fire a gun. My father taught me." For a heartbeat, Colton hesitated, then reached into his boot and withdrew a small derringer. "2 shots," he said, pressing it into her hand. "Make them count. When I move, wait 10 seconds, then fire once at the man on the left. I'll circle right and come up behind them." Before she could respond, Colton surprised her by cupping her face in his hand, his thumb brushing her cheek. "Be careful," he whispered, then was gone, slipping away into the darkness. Jessamine counted to 10, her pulse roaring in her ears. Then she raised the small pistol, aimed at the shadowy figure moving among the trees, and pulled the trigger. The shot went wide, but it had the desired effect. All attention turned toward her position as return fire peppered the rocks. She pressed herself flat against the ground, praying Colton had made it to safety. Long seconds passed, then the night exploded with gunfire from a new direction. Shouts of confusion turned to cries of pain as Colton's shots found their marks. In the chaos that followed, Jessamine kept her head down, clutching the derringer with its single remaining bullet. When silence finally fell, she was afraid to move, unsure who had prevailed. "Jessamine," Colton's voice called softly, relief flooded through her. "Here." He appeared at the edge of the rocks, rifle in hand. "It's clear, 3 of them all Price's men, One's dead, two wounded badly enough they won't follow. Jessamine rose on shaky legs. The horses. I found your mare. My gelding is long gone, but we can double up. He reached for her hand. We need to move. There could be more of them nearby. They rode through the night, Jessamine seated before Colton on the mare, his arms around her as he held the reins. Despite the danger, despite the uncertainty that still lay ahead, she found herself aware of his proximity, the strength of his chest against her back, the warmth of his breath near her ear when he spoke. By dawn, they had put considerable distance between themselves and the ambush site. They paused only briefly at a stream to refill canteens and allow the overtaxed mare to rest. "How did they find us?" Jessamine asked as Colton examined his injured arm in the growing light. The wound had stopped bleeding but looked angry and raw. "That's what worries me," he replied, wincing as he poured water over the gash. "They shouldn't have known about Sullivan's Pass. Few do." Jessamine tore a strip from her petticoat, using it to bandage his arm. "You think someone knew your plans, someone in Gunnison?" "Or they got lucky," Colton said, though his tone suggested he didn't believe in such coincidences. "Either way, we need to change our approach. Montrose is too obvious now." He studied the rising sun, calculating. "There's a small settlement called Cedar Creek about 15 miles south of here. Too small for a telegraph office or a regular stage, but there's a man there who owes me a favor. He might be willing to get a message to Marshal Hollister." It was their best option, they agreed. They continued south, the terrain gradually shifting from dense forest to more open country, dotted with stands of pine and juniper. By midday, the distant smoke of chimneys came into view. Cedar Creek, a collection of perhaps 20 buildings clustered around a crossroads. "We'll approach from the east," Colton decided. "Less conspicuous that way. The man we're looking for is named Elias Thornton. He runs the general store." They dismounted outside town, leading the tired mare on foot to attract less attention. Jessamine had donned her dress again, though it was wrinkled and trail-worn. Colton kept his hat pulled low, his rifle slung casually but ready. Cedar Creek proved to be even smaller than it had appeared from a distance. A general store, a blacksmith, a small church, and a handful of homes and businesses. Few people moved about the dusty main street, and those who did paid them little mind beyond curious glances at unfamiliar faces. The general store occupied a corner building, its windows displaying a jumble of merchandise from tools to fabric. A bell tinkled as they entered, and an older man with spectacles looked up from behind the counter. "Help you folks?" he asked, then his eyes widened slightly as he recognized Colton. "Well, I'll be McAllister. Been years." "Thornton," Colton nodded, stepping forward to shake the man's hand. "Need to have a word if you don't mind." The storekeeper's gaze flicked to Jessamine, then to Colton's bandaged arm. "Back room," he said simply, leading them through a curtained doorway into a small office. Once the door was closed, Colton explained their situation in succinct terms, omitting specific details about Jessamine's testimony, but making clear the danger they faced from Price's men. "Need to get a message to Federal Marshal Hollister in Denver," Colton concluded, "and somewhere safe to wait until he can meet us." Thornton removed his spectacles, polishing them thoughtfully on his vest. "Harlan Price, man's got a long reach," he sighed, replacing his glasses. "I've got a monthly supply wagon heading to Denver tomorrow. Driver's my nephew, trustworthy lad. He can deliver your message." "And until then?" Jessamine asked. "My sister owns a small place at the edge of town, takes in laundry, keeps to herself. She'd put you up for a night or two, no questions asked." Relief washed over Jessamine. A real bed, perhaps even a bath, luxuries that suddenly seemed impossibly precious. We'd be grateful, Colton said. And I haven't forgotten what you did for James all those years ago. This makes us even. Thornton's expression softened. Your brother was a good man, Colton. Helping his family was no hardship. Within the hour, they were settled in a small but tidy cabin behind Mrs. Alina Winter's modest home. The widow had indeed asked no questions, simply showing them to the guest cabin and promising to bring food later. Elias says you're friends of his, was all she'd said, her kind eyes crinkling at the corners. That's recommendation enough for me. Alone at last, in relative safety, the full weight of the past 2 days descended on Jessamine. She sank onto one of the 2 narrow beds, suddenly exhausted beyond measure. You should rest, Colton said, checking the cabin's windows and door out of habit. I'll keep watch. You need sleep too, she pointed out. You've barely closed your eyes since we left your ranch. He shrugged, the gesture dismissive. I'm used to it. At least let me look at your arm properly, Jessamine insisted, rising to her feet. It needs cleaning. To her surprise, Colton acquiesced without argument. Mrs. Winters had left a basin of water and clean cloths, and Jessamine used these to gently remove the makeshift bandage. The wound beneath was raw and inflamed, though thankfully showing no signs of serious infection. You're lucky, she murmured, cleaning the gash with careful strokes. Another inch and it might have hit something vital. Wasn't luck, Colton replied, his voice low. I saw him aim and moved, just wasn't quite fast enough. Jessamine's hand stilled for a moment as she absorbed the implication that he had deliberately put himself between her and danger. The realization sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. Still, she continued, resuming her ministrations, you should be more careful. I'm not worth dying for. Colton's hand suddenly covered hers, stopping her movement. Don't say that, he said, his eyes intense. Don't ever say that. The air between them changed, charged with something Jessamine hadn't allowed herself to acknowledge until now. Colton was looking at her the way no man ever had, as if she were precious, worthy, more than just the roles she'd been forced to play. A knock at the door shattered the moment. Mrs. Winters had arrived with a tray of food and the welcome news that a bath could be prepared in the main house once they had eaten. The next hours passed in a blur of simple comforts: hot food, clean water, fresh bandages for Colton's arm, and for Jessamine, the luxury of a proper bath. Mrs. Winters even provided clean clothing, a dress that had belonged to her daughter, now married and living in Denver, and a shirt and trousers of her late husband's that fitted Colton passably well. By evening, Jessamine felt almost human again. She sat on the small porch of the cabin, watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. Colton joined her, carrying 2 cups of coffee. Thornton's nephew will leave at first light, he said, handing her a cup. With luck, Hollister could be here within 3 days. Jessamine nodded, sipping the hot coffee. And then you give your testimony and Price finally faces justice. Colton settled beside her on the bench, his shoulder nearly touching hers. After that, well, that's up to you. And you, she asked softly, what will you do? Colton stared into the distance, his profile limned in fading light. Like I said, Colorado's a big place, or maybe New Mexico. Heard there's good ranching land down that way. Jessamine gathered her courage. Would there be room for 2 on such a ranch? The question hung between them, unmistakable in its meaning. Slowly, Colton turned to face her, surprise and something else, hope, perhaps dawning in his eyes. Jessamine, he began, his voice rough with emotion. You don't know me, not really. I know enough, she countered. I know you risked everything for a woman you just met. I know you've suffered loss but haven't let it turn you cruel. I know you can be trusted with a life mine. The life you could have with me, he said carefully. It wouldn't be easy, I'm not a wealthy man. Just a rancher trying to make his way." Jessamine smiled, setting down her coffee cup to place her hand over his. "I've never wanted easy, just honest, just real." Colton's fingers interlaced with hers, the calluses of his palm rough against her skin. "You deserve better than what life's handed you so far." "So do you," she whispered. He leaned toward her then, slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. Instead, Jessamine met him halfway, their lips coming together in a kiss that felt like coming home after a long journey. His hand came up to cradle her face, gentle despite its strength, and Jessamine leaned into his touch, savoring the tenderness she'd never expected to find. When they finally parted, Colton rested his forehead against hers, eyes closed as if memorizing the moment. "I never thought," he murmured. "Nor I," she agreed, understanding perfectly. They might have remained that way longer, but the sound of approaching hoofbeats snapped them both to alertness. Colton was on his feet instantly, reaching for the rifle he'd kept close. "Inside," he ordered, all softness gone from his voice. Jessamine obeyed, peering through the cabin window as Colton positioned himself at the corner of the porch, weapon ready. A lone rider appeared on the road, moving at an unhurried pace. As he drew closer, Jessamine could make out a badge glinting on his chest. "Evening," the rider called, reining in his horse. "Looking for Colton McAllister, told he might be hereabouts." "Who's asking?" Colton replied, not lowering his rifle. The rider dismounted slowly, keeping his hands visible. "Name's Hollister, federal marshal out of Denver." Jessamine gasped softly. The marshal they'd been trying to reach had somehow found them instead. Colton's posture remained wary. "Bit of a coincidence, you showing up here." Hollister nodded, understanding the suspicion. "Got a telegram from Joseph Bennett 3 days ago, right before he was killed. Said he had evidence against Price and a witness who could corroborate. When he turned up dead and a saloon girl went missing the same night, didn't take much figuring." "How did you know to look here?" Colton pressed. "Wasn't looking for you specifically," Hollister admitted. "Been riding a circuit of small settlements, places Price's men might overlook. Cedar Creek was next on my list." He paused, glancing toward the window where Jessamine stood. "That the witness?" Colton finally lowered his rifle, though caution remained in his stance. "She is. Name's Jessamine Reeves. Saw Bennett's murder and can testify to Price's involvement." Hollister nodded, satisfaction evident in his weathered face. "That's what I needed." "Got a circuit judge arriving in Montrose day after tomorrow. With her testimony and the evidence Bennett gathered, we can put Price away for good." Jessamine stepped onto the porch, hope warring with trepidation in her chest. "Will my word be enough?" "I'm just a witness to murder," Hollister interrupted firmly. "That's all the judge needs to know." The unexpected arrival of Marshal Hollister accelerated their plans. They would leave for Montrose at first light, he explained, where a contingent of deputies would ensure their safety until the judge arrived. Price's influence was substantial, but federal authority superseded local corruption. That night, Jessamine found sleep elusive despite her exhaustion. The prospect of testifying, of facing Harlan Price across a courtroom, filled her with dread. Yet there was also anticipation for justice, yes, but also for what might come after. She and Colton had spoken no more of the future since the marshal's arrival, but the memory of his kiss, the promise in his eyes, sustained her through the dark hours. Dawn brought a flurry of activity, hasty goodbyes to Mrs. Winters and Thornton, saddling of horses, and final preparations for the journey to Montrose. Marshal Hollister led the way, with Colton and Jessamine riding side by side behind him. They traveled swiftly but cautiously, taking less obvious routes and maintaining vigilant watch for any sign of pursuit. By mid-afternoon, Montrose came into view, a proper town with wooden sidewalks, a courthouse, and a railway station where trains connected to the larger cities of Denver and Pueblo. Hollister led them directly to the sheriff's office, where arrangements had been made for secure lodging until the judge's arrival. "You'll stay here tonight," Hollister explained, gesturing to a small but clean room adjacent to the jail. "Deputies will rotate shifts outside your door." Price would be a fool to try anything in a federal courthouse, but I'm not taking chances. Jessamine nodded, setting down her meager belongings on one of the two cots. Colton remained by the door, exchanging quiet words with the marshal. "I'll come for you tomorrow morning," Hollister said as he prepared to leave. "Judge Harmon is expected on the noon train. The hearing will begin immediately thereafter." When they were finally alone, an awkward silence fell between them, the first since they'd met. So much had happened, so much had changed, and now the culmination of their journey loomed just hours away. "Are you afraid?" Colton asked finally, taking a seat on the cot opposite hers. Jessamine considered the question honestly. "Yes," she admitted, "but not of testifying. I'm afraid of what comes after." "After?" Colton echoed, his brow furrowing. "When this is over, when Price is in custody and Bennett has justice." She met his gaze squarely. "When you and I have no reason to remain together." Understanding dawned in Colton's eyes, followed by something that looked remarkably like tenderness. He rose from his cot and came to sit beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. "I meant what I said, Jessamine," he said quietly, "about there being room for two. If that's still what you want." Relief coursed through her, sweet and overwhelming. "It is," she whispered, "more than anything." He took her hand in his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "I know we've known each other only days, but I can't imagine going forward without you beside me." "Then don't," Jessamine said simply. His kiss this time was different, deeper, more certain, a promise rather than a question. Jessamine leaned into it, allowing herself to believe in a future she'd never dared imagine. The following day dawned bright and clear, a perfect autumn morning in the mountains. Jessamine woke early, nervous energy making rest impossible. She dressed in the clean clothes Mrs. Winters had provided, grateful for the simple but respectable appearance they afforded her. Colton was already awake, speaking with one of the deputies outside their door. He turned as she emerged, his expression softening at the sight of her. "Marshal Hollister sent word," he said. "Judge Harmon's train is running on schedule, should arrive within the hour." Jessamine nodded, her stomach nodding with anticipation. "And after the hearing, what happens then? If the judge finds sufficient cause, which he will, Price will be taken to Denver for trial. You'll need to testify there as well, but as a federal witness, you'll have protection." Colton hesitated. "Hollister mentioned that might take weeks, possibly months." "I see," Jessamine said, understanding the unspoken question. "What would become of them during that time?" "And you?" Before Colton could answer, the door opened to admit Marshal Hollister, his expression grim. "Change of plans," he announced without preamble. "Price knows you're here. Someone in the telegraph office must have tipped him off." Alarm coursed through Jessamine. "Is he coming?" "Worse," Hollister replied. "He's already here. Arrived last night with a dozen men, all heavily armed. They're staying at the hotel across from the courthouse, making no secret of their presence." "It's intimidation," Colton said, anger evident in his voice. "He's trying to frighten Jessamine into silence." Hollister nodded. "That would be my guess, but don't worry, Miss Reeves. The courthouse will be secured, and I've telegraphed for additional deputies. They'll arrive on the same train as Judge Harmon." Despite his reassurances, fear clawed at Jessamine's chest. Price's boldness suggested a man who believed himself untouchable or who had nothing left to lose. The hours that followed passed in a blur of tension and preparation. Judge Harmon arrived as scheduled, a stern-faced man with piercing blue eyes who listened to Hollister's briefing with grave attention. Additional deputies secured the courthouse, checking every entrance and window. By early afternoon, all was in readiness for the preliminary hearing that would determine if Harlan Price would stand trial for murder. "It's time," Hollister said, appearing at their door. "Judge Harmon is ready for your testimony, Miss Reeves." Jessamine rose on shaky legs, smoothing her skirts with trembling hands. Colton moved to her side, his presence steady and reassuring. "I'll be right there with you," he promised quietly. "Every step." The courtroom was smaller than Jessamine had imagined, with simple wooden benches and a raised platform where Judge Harmon sat behind a massive oak desk. Deputies stood at every door, hands resting on holstered weapons. And there, on the far side of the room, sat Harlan Price with his attorney, a slender man in an expensive suit who looked out of place among the frontier trappings. Price's eyes locked with Jessamine's as she entered, his thin lips curving in a smile that contained no warmth. She faltered momentarily, the weight of his malice palpable across the room. "Miss Reeves," Judge Harmon called, his voice cutting through her fear. "Please approach the bench." Step by careful step, Jessamine made her way forward, conscious of Colton's supportive presence just behind her. She was sworn in, her hand trembling slightly on the Bible, then directed to a chair beside the judge's bench. "Miss Reeves," the prosecutor began, a serious man introduced as Mr. Calloway. "Please tell the court in your own words what you witnessed on the night of September 18th, 1878. Jessamine took a deep breath, then began her testimony. She spoke clearly and directly, describing how she had overheard Price and his men planning Bennett's murder, how she had witnessed the actual killing from the back door of the saloon, and how Price had ordered his men to silence her when he realized she had seen everything. Throughout her testimony, Price's expression never changed. That same cold, calculating smile remained fixed on his face. Only when she described specific details of the murder did a flicker of surprise cross his features, quickly suppressed. When she finished, Price's attorney rose for cross-examination. "Miss Reeves, you work in a saloon, is that correct?" "Yes, sir. The Silver Dollar in Gunnison." "And in what capacity do you work there?" Jessamine lifted her chin. "I serve drinks and deal cards. Nothing else." The attorney pressed, his implication clear. "No other services for the establishment's male patrons." "Objection," Calloway interjected. "The witness's occupation is irrelevant to her testimony." "I'm establishing credibility, Your Honor," Price's attorney argued smoothly. Judge Harmon frowned. "I'll allow the question, but tread carefully, counselor." Jessamine met the attorney's gaze steadily. "No, sir. No other services." The cross-examination continued, the attorney attempting to undermine her testimony by questioning her memory, suggesting she had been drinking, implying she had a vendetta against Price. Through it all, Jessamine remained composed, her answers clear and consistent. Finally, the attorney tried a different approach. "Miss Reeves, isn't it true that you conspired with Joseph Bennett to blackmail Mr. Price? That when he refused to pay, you concocted this story of murder?" Anger flashed through Jessamine, burning away her remaining fear. "That is absolutely false," she stated firmly. "I had never met Mr. Bennett before the night he was murdered. I witnessed Harlan Price order his death, and then saw his men carry out that order in the alley behind the Silver Dollar." A murmur ran through the courtroom at the conviction in her voice. Even Judge Harmon seemed impressed by her unwavering testimony. After Jessamine stepped down, Marshal Hollister presented Bennett's evidence documents detailing Price's corruption. witness statements he had gathered, and financial records showing mysterious payments to local officials. When all evidence had been presented, Judge Harmon retired to consider his decision. The wait seemed interminable, the tension in the courtroom thickening with each passing minute. Colton sat beside Jessamine, his hand occasionally brushing hers in silent support. At last, Judge Harmon returned, his expression solemn as he took his seat. "Having reviewed the evidence and testimony presented today, I find sufficient cause to bind over Harlan Price for trial on charges of murder, conspiracy, corruption, and witness intimidation. Bail is denied due to the serious nature of these charges and the defendant's apparent influence in the territory." Relief washed over Jessamine in a dizzying wave. Beside her, Colton released a breath she hadn't realized he'd been holding. As deputies moved to take Price into custody, the saloon owner finally lost his composure. "This isn't over," he shouted, eyes fixed on Jessamine with murderous rage. "You think you're safe? I have men everywhere. You'll never. That's enough," Judge Harmon thundered, banging his gavel. "Remove the defendant immediately and place him in secure confinement until transport to Denver can be arranged." Price continued shouting threats as he was dragged from the courtroom, his voice fading only when the heavy doors closed behind him. In the aftermath, Marshal Hollister approached them, satisfaction evident in his weathered face. "Well done, Miss Reeves. Your testimony was compelling and credible. The trial in Denver should be straightforward with such strong evidence. When will that be?" Jessamine asked, still trembling slightly from the confrontation. "Not for at least a month," Hollister replied. "The federal circuit is backed up and will need time to gather additional witnesses." He hesitated, glancing between her and Colton. "You'll need to remain available, of course." "The federal government can provide accommodation in Denver until the trial concludes." Jessamine nodded, though uncertainty filled her at the thought of weeks or months in a strange city. "I understand." "Actually," Colton interjected, stepping forward, "if it's all the same to you, Marshal, I believe I can ensure Miss Reeves remains safe and available for testimony." Hollister raised an eyebrow. "Is that so?" "I own property near Durango," Colton continued. "Remote enough to be secure but close enough to reach Denver when needed. And I believe Marshal Thornton in that district is an acquaintance of yours." A knowing look crossed Hollister's face. "Indeed he is. Fine man, Thornton." He stroked his mustache thoughtfully. "I suppose such an arrangement could work, provided you maintain regular contact and inform us of any change in circumstances." Relief and something like joy bloomed in Jessamine's chest. She looked at Colton, finding his eyes already on her, warm with promise. "That would be acceptable," she said softly. As they left the courthouse, stepping into the golden light of late afternoon, Jessamine felt a weight lift from her shoulders. Price was in custody, justice for Bennett was in motion, and before her stretched a future she had never dared to imagine. "Did you mean it?" she asked as they walked toward the hotel where they would spend one final night before departing. "About Durango," Colton nodded, taking her hand in his. "I have land there, good land. Started buying it after James died, thinking someday I might move on from Gunnison." He paused, his expression growing serious. "It's nothing fancy, just a small cabin and some acreage, but it could be a home." "Our home?" Jessamine asked, hardly daring to believe. "If you want it to be," Colton replied, his voice rough with emotion. "Jessamine, I know this has all happened fast, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life. I love you. I want to build a life with you if you'll have me." Tears welled in Jessamine's eyes, not of sorrow, but of overwhelming joy. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes to all of it." Colton pulled her to him then, right there on the street, heedless of curious onlookers. His kiss was a promise, a beginning, and Jessamine returned it with all the hope that had bloomed in her heart since the night she had shown up at his ranch door, desperate and afraid. They were married 2 weeks later in a small ceremony at the church in Cedar Creek, with Mrs. Winters, Elias Thornton, and Marshall Hollister in attendance. Jessamine wore a simple white dress that Alina Winters had altered from her daughters, and Colton a new shirt and string tie that made him look uncomfortable but handsome. Their journey to Durango took them through some of the most beautiful country Jessamine had ever seen: towering mountains, verdant valleys, and rushing rivers that sparkled in the autumn sunlight. When they finally crested a rise to reveal a small cabin nestled in a sheltered meadow, Colton reined in his horse. "Welcome home," he said simply. The cabin was rustic but solid, with a small corral for horses and a barn that needed some repair. Inside was sparse but clean: a stone fireplace, a table with chairs, and a bedroom with a bed large enough for two. It wasn't grand by any measure, but to Jessamine it was perfect. "It needs work," Colton acknowledged as they stood in the doorway, surveying what would become their home. "And furniture and curtains, I suppose," Jessamine laughed, slipping her arm around his waist. "It needs us," she corrected. "Everything else will come with time." They settled into a rhythm of work and discovery, repairing the barn, planting a small garden that would bear fruit the following spring, adding those curtains Colton had mentioned. Marshall Thornton from the Durango office visited occasionally, bringing news of Price's upcoming trial, and, once, a letter from Mrs. Winters with recipes and homemaking advice. On a crisp December morning, with snow dusting the mountains and smoke curling from their chimney, Colton returned from checking their small herd of cattle to find Jessamine sitting by the fire, an expression of wonder on her face. "What is it?" he asked, setting aside his hat and gloves. She looked up, joy illuminating her features. "I'm with child," she said simply. "Come spring, we'll be 3 instead of 2. Colton crossed the room in 3 strides, gathering her into his arms with a gentleness that belied his strength. "A baby," he whispered against her hair. "Our baby." "Are you happy?" Jessamine asked, though she could read the answer in his shining eyes. "More than I ever thought possible," he replied, his hand moving to rest on her still flat stomach. "When you showed up at my ranch that night, I thought I was saving you. I never realized you were actually saving me." In February, they traveled to Denver for Price's trial. The city was a shock after months in their peaceful valley: noisy, crowded, overwhelming in its energy. But Jessamine faced the courtroom with courage, her testimony just as clear and compelling as it had been in Montrose. Harlan Price was convicted on all counts and sentenced to hang. As they left the courthouse for the final time, Colton drew Jessamine close, protective of her visibly pregnant form. "It's over," he said, relief evident in his voice. "Truly over." Jessamine nodded, watching as Price was led away in chains. "Justice for Bennett, for your brother, for all of them. And a new beginning for us," Colton added, his hand finding hers. Their son was born in May, a healthy boy with Colton's eyes and Jessamine's auburn hair. They named him James, after the uncle he would never meet, but whose memory lived on in the stories his father would tell him. By summer, their little ranch was thriving, the cattle fat on mountain grass, the garden yielding vegetables in abundance, and the cabin transformed into a true home filled with laughter and love. Occasionally, visitors would arrive: Marshall Hollister passing through on territorial business, or Elias Thornton delivering supplies and news from Cedar Creek. On the anniversary of the night Jessamine had appeared at Colton's door, they sat on the porch of their cabin, watching the sunset paint the western sky in glorious hues while baby James slept peacefully inside. You ever think about how differently things might have gone?" Jessamine asked, her head resting on Colton's shoulder. "If I hadn't heard Price that night, or if you hadn't opened your door to a desperate stranger," Colton's arm tightened around her. "I think fate had a hand in bringing you to me," he said quietly. "Some things are just meant to be." Jessamine smiled, thinking of the journey that had led them here from fear and danger to love and family, from strangers to partners in every sense of the word. "I'm glad you opened that door," she said, lifting her face for his kiss. "Best decision I ever made," Colton replied, his lips meeting hers with the same tenderness as the first time. "And one I'd make again every day for the rest of my life." As darkness settled over their mountain home, stars appearing one by one in the velvet sky, Jessamine knew with absolute certainty that she had found her place in the world, not in the saloons of Gunnison or the streets of Denver, but here, in this cabin, with this man and their child. The path had been dangerous and uncertain, but it had led her home, and when baby James woke with a hungry cry, they went inside together to tend to their son, their future stretching before them as vast and promising as the Colorado sky.